analyze every service, every function, every feature, and ask yourself, is this necessary on this device? And if it's not, removing it.
Hello, everybody. This is the IoT Security Podcast. I'm Eric Johansen, and we have a great guest for you today, IoT hacker Matt Brown of Brown Fine Security. Today, we are covering all kinds of topics, IoT attack surface, our favorite IoT devices, and even some tips for shopping on Amazon. Hey, Matt, thanks for joining us today. My main question, and I think a lot of people, at the same thing, it's kind of like, how did you get into this, right? Just you kind of been everywhere as when you talk about the IoT scene. So what kind of dropped you into where you are today?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you for having me on. And my background in IoT hacking, I guess, kind of started with my background in hacking itself. And so I was really interested in computers as a kid, and I loved taking apart electronics. I learned to solder when I was a kid. So all these requisite interests and skills I felt were lurking in my background. And then when I went off to school, I specialized in cybersecurity, but all the while was doing tinkering and kind of side projects in the area of hardware devices. And then once I kind of launched into my career, I got some opportunities to work for companies that produced IoT devices, and the rest was history, as they say. There's a lot of details I'm leaving out, but I'm interested if there's anything in particular, you're wanting to know from that question.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I thought it would be because at least as far as my interest went, it was when I was growing up, it was a lot cheaper to work with smaller embedded devices than, say, perhaps the family computer. If you make a mistake. So that's cool. So you actually were in the business itself, and were you doing analysis professionally for that organization, or was it kind of tangentially related and then you got into this?
Even within my college and university studies, I was getting some exposure to embedded devices there, but then really started to specialize in that area when I took a role that was, researching offensive capabilities and specifically trying to do, vulnerability research on embedded targets. And that was one work experience that I had. And then I've also had some work experience at a company that produces IoT devices, and getting to learn all the nitty-gritty details of how supply chains work, of how vulnerabilities don't just exist in one product, but they exist in a whole family of products, right? And so I got a lot of hands-on experience with IoT devices there, and working closely with engineers and third-party partners and stuff like that to find and fix vulns.
Very cool. Tell us more about that offensive component, or at least what you can say. You mentioned working for a vendor, so I assume it wasn't that particular role wasn't a vendor itself. Like that was, military or anything like that, or.
Yeah, so that was again very early on in my career. I took a position at Lockheed Martin
Ah,
where
okay.
I was doing research, and the long story short is that I ended up kind of taking an exit from that company and going to work at a startup, and I kind of went away from IoT for a little bit, but that got my interests in that embedded, and that was all obviously unclassified work that I was doing.
Yeah.
But looking into vulnerabilities and specifically embedded Linux devices, and I've been a long time Linux user. I'm running Linux right now on my desktop, daily driving it, and so that's always been something I've been passionate about. And then getting to use my Linux expertise and kind of combine it with cybersecurity, because so many of these embedded devices out there, these IoT devices, are running Linux under the hood because it's free, it's lightweight in terms of resource utilization, at least compared with other modern full operating systems, right, like Windows or something like that. So you see a lot of that in the wild, and that made me good at finding vulns on these targets. And so, but yeah,
Well,
it was more of that kind of military contractor background that got me started and got me really interested in these devices.
interesting. And so when you think about that experience and then obviously, everything since then, this is kind of a generic question, but I feel like the open-endedness makes it more interesting. But like, what's kind of been the most surprising device for you? Like, or has it not been surprising because so many things are just essentially vulnerable and full of holes and that type of thing?
Yeah, I could take that question in a lot of directions. There's sometimes I get surprised when something isn't chocked full of vulnerabilities, right?
Hmm.
When I get my hands on a device and I'm like, oh, they actually did take the time to, for example, in the embedded Linux world, I have this running joke that in IoT, the class of vulnerability for privilege escalation doesn't exist because everything runs as root, right? So
Well,
if everything in the environment runs as root, you don't need to escalate your privileges from some lower user up to that root. So sometimes I get surprised when I see privilege separation and running with low privileged accounts on devices. But I would say what's surprising to me is, in some sense, what I found, this is another thing I found really interesting about the whole IoT world, is you kind of get to do some time traveling. And that's because oftentimes these embedded systems are a platform that's been developed over a long period of time, and there is no way they're going to ever be able to update the kernel that's running or the critical libraries on that device. It would just be way too hard. And oftentimes the people who have developed these platforms or these software development kits for embedded devices are long gone from the initial company, and so trying to maintain them is really hard, which means oftentimes you get your hands on an embedded device and it's running a kernel from 10 years ago, from 15 years ago,
right.
right? And so you have all of this obviously legacy attack surface that you have to deal with on these devices. You just get to exploit types of vulnerabilities that are so much harder to exploit today.
Yeah.
So that is a surprising thing, because when I was coming out of university, right, I was learning about all these memory protections. For example, in Linux, you have, a lot more advanced exploitation techniques, like oriented programming to get around, memory protections like ASLR and, no execute and stuff like that. And so, but on these older Linux devices, sometimes you'll find devices that have a kernel version that's even before ASLR was implemented, right? As a younger hacker who maybe feels like some like I missed out on this nostalgia of like the golden age of hacking, like the old school DEF CON crew and stuff like that. I feel like IoT, you sometimes get to like do some time traveling
Go back.
back to a simpler age
Right.
of exploitation and stuff like that. So yeah,
When it was, yeah, a lot less steps involved to make that initial entry point. So I guess
yeah,
when you talk about time travel, I guess another good topic would be, I guess, on the surprising front, if we keep with that track, what has been, I guess, one in your opinion, one of the best mitigation strategies when you're talking about what you just mentioned, where these things come off a factory line and they're just going to go live. They're not going to ever go away until someone unplugs them because, like you say, they're essentially static. And yeah, there might be firmware updates, but in general, most people aren't proactively making that update happen. So knowing that they're shipping something, and I would, I'm just curious, like, what's the best mitigation strategy that you've seen? Because IoT devices, the challenge is always the resources. They don't have enough where you can just, put in, an IPS on the network level or what have you. So kind of what's been the coolest mitigation strategy that you've seen, or a few?
yeah. The way you frame the question, right? Because the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, build a very solid firmware update pipeline, right? But you rightly have pointed out that for many IoT devices, that is
And
not
that's
it.
how Amazon, Apple, and Google deal with it, right? And I mean, because I
Yeah,
think when we all think about
right.
IoT, they're the ones that are really doing it well because
They
they've
are.
built
Yeah.
that methodology for updating. So sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
No, you're so right. And so I've so this is like even kind of like leaving the embedded security world and just stepping into what you want to do on a good, like, when you're engineering, when you are producing a new IoT device. I would say the single most important feature is your OTA firmware update process, right? But
Okay.
so setting that aside, as far as mitigations go, I would say it's I'm gonna kind of like do some hand waving here, but I would say one, or like almost like step zero, is understanding your specific threat model, right? Understanding what threats are going to come after your device that might not be the same threats that come after somebody else's device, right? If we think of, like, you mentioned companies like Amazon and Apple, right? Like Apple, I can't think of of another company that has a higher threat model, a more exposed threat model to, because they have nation state actors coming after them, that, they have governments, they have very well funded, criminal enterprises that are wanting to find vulnerabilities in their platform. um, or let's take another type of embedded device and talk about the threat model, right? A crypto wallet, a hardware crypto wallet. Well, in that threat model, if I can gain access, like debug access to the hardware, that's the whole game, right? That compromises their entire threat model, right? To keep you out of the internal memories of the device, right? Whereas maybe your Wi-Fi router that you have, in your home, that they might not worry about that as much, right? If I can get, by gaining physical access to my device, if I can modify my own device with physical access, maybe they're not concerned about that threat. So just to answer that question, that my first answer is you need to know your threat model and you need to target what you care about, because security, you're always playing a game of resource allocation, right? Like, where do I spend my time, my mind share on solving security problems? And I would say you need to understand your threat model and the market that your product's going into really well to know what to spend time on. And then the second that kind of comes out of that is just reducing your exposure, right? So this is really simple thing. So again, my most of my experience is in the embedded Linux world, and if you have a service that's open on your device and it doesn't need to be open, then close it. It's that simple, right?
Right.
Instead of trying to worry about, oh, let me do scan it, if there's some service that has some very complicated exploit, it's like, yeah, well, we could design, tools to do source code analysis. Uh, in the IoT world, sometimes you don't have source code. That's like the dirty little secret of these supply chains,
Just
right?
grabbing busy box and throwing it on something and, whatever. Yeah.
Or company whose name is slapped on the front of the device, right? They contract with another company to do the software development, and then they don't have it in the contract that they should have the source code, right? That actually is someone else's IP. And so it kind of
Uh,
goes along the supply chain, right? And then the company whose name is on the product doesn't even have source code, right? So what do you do then? But I'm kind of diverging there. But just every service, analyze every service, every function, every feature, and ask yourself, is this necessary on this device? And if it's not, removing it. There are many IoT devices out there that don't need to have a single port open because the device doesn't get connected to, it connects out to a cloud server,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So I would say those are kind of my, like, my two answers to that question of, like, know your threat model, like, know what you're up
Mm.
against in the wide world that's out
Yeah.
there in the cyber landscape, and then reduce the attack surface, reduce the amount of places where they can attack you.
Well, essentially least privilege, kind of like what you were talking about with you're used to just getting root automatically. So there is no privilege exit. So when you see that, you're like, wow, that's quite cool. I mean, I think it's a tough question, and I think you answered it well adeptly as far as like kind of tiptoeing around all these things. Because when you really look at IoT devices, it's so crazy when you think about like the stuff that just has to be there in order for the device to be used by your typical end user. Things
Yeah.
like factory default credentials, which to ask an engineer to secure something that not only has to live, say, 5 years in someone's house minimum, but then it has to have default credentials so they can set it up easily, and it's got to have a web browser so they can access it, and or an app or what have you. And so you kind of layer all those things on, and it's a extremely tough challenge. And by the way, it has to be as cheap as possible so we can mass produce it. So it's just like, you know, here it just slowly gets down to that point where, that's like where at Phosphorus, like that's all we focus on is finding them, assessing that attack surface that you mentioned, and then having the capability to change credentials, upgrade firmware so you can get to like kind of the most healthy state as quickly as possible. But like in reality, I mean, this is something I was thinking about is like, if I have to go to somebody's grandmother and make a recommendation, for safe IoT, I think we go back to what we were just talking about. Like in general, the recommendation would be go for the big names that you recognize, because as you start, I think we've all gone through this in Amazon, is you go and you say, like a great example is I was looking for dash cams. You can
Yeah.
hardly find a dash cam that is like a brand that They're all going to be all these weird, rebadged, relabeled type of devices. And so, I think that's one of the big things that can make it murky for these people is like you just look at the reviews, people say it works well, but as far as that risk factor and what you're introducing to your ecosystem, whether that's your home network or what have you, like it's just such a Wild West type environment.
It
Yeah.
really is. Yeah, those for the stuff I do for my YouTube content and finding fun devices to hack on, it's funny because the advice I always get a question from people in my Discord or in my community. What device should I look at to like should I start? I want to learn IoT hacking. And I'm like, well, definitely don't go and get a device from Amazon or Apple
Yeah.
or right?
Yeah.
No, go
Don't
to
do
the
hard
listing.
mode.
Go to the listing that you're talking about. Go to Amazon and find like the cheapest thing that
Yeah.
you can, and have a brand that you don't recognize at all, right? And
Yeah.
start there. That will be a less painful learning experience from the offensive side
Right.
of the world. Yeah.
And I mean, is that kind of your general tip? I think like a lot of people are like, hey, I see what Matt's doing. It's really cool. I'm interested in it. Like kind of along those lines, what are your tips for people like that? Is it generally just, hey, get a device, start hacking around, do some packet capture? Kind of how do you kind of prescribe that if someone asks that? Which I think all of us in cybersecurity have been asked that, and it's like, at least for me, I'm always like, well, you have to have some kind of acumen. It's kind of hard when someone's like, I want to get into cybersecurity and they may be doing something else over here. Cause like if you don't have a passion for it, it can kind of be hard. But like, kind of how do you answer that?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I resonate with what you're saying there. If there's no passion, or if the passion is sometimes misguided,
Yeah. Like I
uh,
want I want to make money. Like,
I yeah,
look at
I
look
was
at
just
look
gonna
at
say
Matt
that.
and look at that belt. I mean, this is the type of like I bet you've got a Scrooge McDuck vault somewhere full of gold, right? Because of
Oh man,
yeah.
it's like that meme format with the person who's trying to like climb upstairs and he's like stepping over like five stairs,
Yeah.
to get to the top stair. I don't know if you've seen that meme format, right?
Yeah.
And it's been used many times, right? But that's oftentimes what people want to do in cybersecurity. Oh, like learn the basics of networking, of operating systems, of like using
Yeah.
Wireshark, really basic, like basic stuff. It's like, no, I want to skip over that and
Yeah.
get to the cool
It's like
stuff.
people that are like, I want to learn how to be a forensic analyst, and they're not even in IT at all, and you're just like, whoa. That's like,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. So so I guess in general, the recommendation is go to Amazon, find the most crazy off-brand device. Is there like a, not that it's your favorite device, but is there like a class or a certain type of device, or like, you know, like imagine we're going to Mos Eisley, and we all know what we're getting into in the Star Wars universe. It's just, the hive of scum and villainy. And so, how do you introduce yourself into that world when you're looking for a device? And I'm sure you maybe don't have to anymore in your career now, but like if you were to put yourself in that shoe, where you're those shoes where you're like on Best Buy or Amazon or Walmart or whatever, trying to figure out what interesting device to get.
Yeah. So to go back to that question, right? The way I usually answer it is I would recommend that they find a blog or a YouTube video or something that where somebody has already gone down a path with a specific device that you can then go buy that same device. And the first step is just to try to follow all the same steps on your own that you see in the blog. And then you're going to, you know, maybe encounter some problems along the way. Maybe they didn't give you complete information, and you can learn by not having to learn everything from scratch, right? You can do some hand holding down that hacking journey. And when you get to the end of that, then you can decide, oh, I want to look around for more things. I followed this blog and it taught me how to get a UART shell by, soldering and plugging into something on the device. Now let me look for other interesting things on the device to look for, right? Uh, I would say, but starting by imitating, imitate something that you see in a blog or a video, and you're gonna have little wins along the way that keep you motivated and wanting to learn more.
Practice the tools and techniques and see if you have an aptitude for it or an interest once you're practicing along to validate that. Kind of like when I was in college, for some reason, my wife tells us she's always makes fun of me. She's like, because I wanted to be in criminal justice when I went to college, and one of the first things they do is they have the police come and like kind of show you some gory pictures, and that was the first thing I realized. I don't like blood. And I'm like, why did I ever, but then here I am in
Yep.
cybersecurity. It's perfect. There's the digital component. There's not, all that. So I guess, I didn't become Batman, but here I am. I'm still in cybersecurity, which is, interesting, but,
Yeah, I had that experience in my first programming class in college when half the class realized that it wasn't like playing video games, right?
yeah, yeah,
they like to
yeah,
play video
yeah,
games, and then it turns out that it's a lot more. There's logic and math and all this
yeah.
other stuff involved in computer programming, right? Yeah.
That's a great point, Matt, because I mean, the things that you do in your videos are awesome, and it's so cool, but it's like behind that, how many hours do you think you put into a video, a final output? I mean, you've got to put in a lot of work, and I mean, even just looking at the equipment behind you, I mean, there's so many layers. It's not just like the Matrix stuff is coming down and you're wearing shades and it's just cool music playing. It's like, you're burning the midnight oil, you're, whatever. But kind of what does
Yeah.
that look like for you when you think about you're outputting a video that's 15, 30 minutes, hour, whatever, but what do you have to put in for that?
Yeah, it really depends on the device and on the context, but oftentimes I'll be at a minimum, any device I pick up, I'm going to try to do background research, right? Because I want to see, has anyone already gone before me and learned something? Because I don't want to, I mean, one, I don't want to make a video that's just like, oh, I found this thing, and it turns out like 5 years ago somebody did the same thing, right?
Yeah,
Or if they did and I'm still do the video, I want to credit them. I want to like cite my work. So there's a
right.
lot of research and reading other people's blog posts. There is obviously like taking apart the device, and I do try to show some of my struggles on my video, but like me struggling for multiple hours to like find one thing is not exactly good content.
Yeah.
So so there is an element to which I do a lot of like work ahead of time where I'll struggle to find, a debug interface and how to solder onto it properly, or what I need to do after I pull a firmware chip off to do the analysis. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of prep work, and I would say just like uh, sometimes I have to write code to perform analysis that's very custom, and it's like
Right.
it's a one-off thing. So you do really get pulled into the weeds. I personally like it. This
Yeah.
kind of goes even
Mediation.
higher level, but one of the things I really like about IoT is because I like to keep learning all different kinds of technologies. And the cool thing about IoT is it's often the intersection between multiple different technologies, right? So just if you have a device, it's not like just the device. Oftentimes it's communicating to a cloud server. So you have to know networking, you have to know about cloud infrastructure. You oftentimes have a mobile app, so that now you have mobile app security that's involved, and the communication between the mobile app and the cloud. Or maybe there's like other wireless protocols like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth involved. So it
Yeah.
really kind of brings in tons of different technologies and makes it fun. So,
Yeah, my mind went to LoRaWAN. I mean, that's such like,
ooh, yeah,
and even you mentioned crypto wallets. And so, I messed around with Helium, which is just basically a single board computer inside, and then, the LoRaWAN antennas and then all that good stuff. And it's just like, yeah, it's so true. There's so many like different cool avenues kind of tied to it. But I guess like back to that question, like, so how, if you make a video, what would you say, 20 hours goes into it? 10,
yeah, 5 to 10. Yeah,
5 to 10.
I do usually. Yeah, my videos are a little bit different in that sometimes I purposefully leave a part of the video that I've never done before to like give people that experience of me trying to figure it out.
Right.
So sometimes I will like analyze part of the device and then I will show that part, and then I'll go a step beyond that and show people that real time reaction, which sometimes those videos fail and they never get uploaded to YouTube. So there is also that aspect of it too. So
It's not always, it doesn't always make for a good video, but I mean, I think it's
yeah,
that experience and what you're going through, like, is also what's so amazing because of IoT. Like the things we just talked about, like there's just so many different vessels for these embedded devices to enable things, whether they're a sensor or, the biomet, like just like a million different ways that IoT devices are utilized. And especially today, it just keeps increasing. Like I always use this analogy with people. It's like, when you go to Best Buy now, I mean, you can't even buy a dumb device. Like you're going to have a refrigerator that wants on your Wi-Fi. I mean, everything wants telemetry. We all know TVs are essentially subsidized now and the price is low so they can get information about your viewing habits and network and all of those good things. So
yeah.
it's pretty incredible, which I mean, most people have no problem with that. They're happy to take that on. I guess with that, from the TV conversation, because I think in general we look at that space, and there's a lot of vendors that are kind of doing some. They're pushing the envelope ethically, I think, with some of that, and I think it's kind of like Facebook or whatever 10 years ago. But are there any vendors that you would not put on blast, but like, is there like a particular like bad offender, or do you not necessarily want to go there, or I guess, do you want to speak agnostically, or kind of how do you look at that?
That is, yeah, no, that's a good question. I have limited experience with smart TVs and stuff like that. It is an area that I have been very interested to get into. Definitely not putting them on blast, but as a
Well, I mean,
part
like
of,
in general,
yeah,
IoT, kind of using that as an example of kind of how consumers are exposed to it on a regular basis. Is there like a particular brand that you've worked with through your efforts that is
yeah.
consistently, disappointing or what have you,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I don't have as much experience in to be able to give you that.
Yeah.
I do know that I am sketched out, and I will say I have one of these TVs in my house. But I believe the brand is TLC
Oh,
or TCL, or it's one of those.
TCL.
It's yeah,
Yeah. It's a
TCL.
Roku. Is it Roku or something, or Google Play or something like that?
It's an Android based
Yeah.
I believe it's like an app, a Google TV based
Yeah.
platform. But the thing when you dig into those different systems is that they are running Android, and but oftentimes you don't know what they're running the Android open source project, right? And so you don't know what modifications they've made, right? Because the Android open source project it's in the name. It's an open source project, so they can fork it and they can add whatever sketchy apps or they can modify the OS itself, and you would never really have visibility into that as a consumer.
Yeah.
So I yeah, those do concern me, and I believe that they've kind of been pointed out by the U.S. government, CISA,
Yeah.
or some other big name entities before. So there are definitely some concerns there. Sometimes I have IoT devices in my house that sketch me out, and I'm like, that's a future project that's
Yeah.
that's in my house there. So yeah.
All right. Well, one last question here, and this you can be quick with it because maybe you don't want to expose this question, but what is in Matt Brown's house when it comes to IoT? You kind of hinted at the TV. Like, I mean, I know personally, I've got some stuff here because of like the lab element, that's the excuse I use. But I mean, I've got some stuff here I probably shouldn't have on the network because it's like older stuff, but it's like you do what you can to mitigate it as best as you can. But are there any things that you're using that you're just like, geez, I got to take care of that? Or do you kind of, you have a Faraday cage around stuff, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, part of the Faraday cage is living on 10 acres out in the woods. So
Ah,
but so there are two devices that are in my house that I'm like, I need to make these research projects. One is my grill or my charcoal smoker, and
okay.
so it's master built, and it
Yeah.
has like you connect it to your Wi-Fi, and it's got this app that lets you control,
Yeah.
via some cloud server API. It lets you like control the
It's a
heat
piece of
on your
crap, right? Because
grill.
like I was just helping my cousin with his, and I could not believe how fickle it was. And it's like, dude, how do people
Yep.
use this?
I have to remove it and re-add it all the time. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And because that's a challenge, it's a grill, so it's not going to be in your living room where you have great reception.
Yeah. So I mean, and that's why that could be a cool project. Almost like not even, yes, the security part of it. And this is where on the content on my YouTube channel, there's this crossover between cybersecurity issues and jailbreaking and trying or open source modification of closed embedded devices, right? So that would be a great use case if I could, you know, have it connect to my own server, and so that I can more reliably,
Yeah.
change the heat on my grill. The other thing I'll answer really quickly, I have a Samsung oven, and I've never used any of the smart capabilities, but it is right now broadcasting a Wi-Fi SSID. So
Wow. So it actually,
like,
wow, it's a router in of itself. That's insane.
and that might just be part of the setup process, right? It might
Right.
only have that AP open for you to do the setup, but that could be a way that somebody could control the oven, I guess. But
Yeah.
we'll
Wow.
see. Future projects.
Yeah. All right, Matt. How can people find you and your content that we've been talking about here today?
Yeah, thanks. So primarily, I am on YouTube. You can type Matt Brown into YouTube or Matt Brown IoT, and you should find my channel. I'm the IoT hacking YouTuber. I'm not the UFC fighter, although
It's a
some
belt in your
people might.
background. You're not doing a good job to debunk that.
Oh yeah, I know, right? Yeah. Well, I promise. I promise. I'm not living two lives. So, yeah. So Matt Brown on YouTube, and then I go by nmat0 on GitHub and on X. So that's primarily how you can reach out. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thank you very much for joining us today, Matt. Really appreciate it. It was a fun conversation. And geez, I actually wish we could go longer, but
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, thanks for having me on.
And thank you for watching. Matt, really enjoyed the conversation. It was really fun geeking out with you. The IoT Security Podcast is brought to you by Phosphorus, the leading provider of proactive, unified security management for the extended Internet of Things. I'm Eric Johansen, and we'll be back soon with more of the IoT Security Podcast.